Wickedly Judged, the podcast dedicated to exposing wrongful convictions and fighting for justice reform in America. I'm Rebecca, and if you're new here, this show is for anyone who believes that justice isn't just a verdict. It's a promise, a process, and far too often, a fight. At Wickedly Judged, we shine a light on the cracks in our justice system by sharing the real stories of those who have been wrongfully accused, convicted, and forgotten by the courts. We give a voice to the families, friends, and survivors who refuse to accept injustice as the end of their story. Before we dive in, a quick thank you to our sponsors: Veteran Alliance, Yarn Therapy for Me, Justin Apron, Liberty First Radio, NDVLB, Crime Ledger Group, JSIL, and Wickedly Judged Justice Activation Project. And a special thanks to JP Verse of Versefire Records for providing our powerful intro and outro music. Your support fuels our mission. Thank you for standing with us in the fight to expose wrongful convictions and demand true justice. If you're listening to this episode, first of all, thank you, because I know it's been a while. A lot of people have messaged me asking, where did you go? Why did the podcast disappear? Are you still fighting? Did you give up? And honestly, that question is harder to answer than people probably realize. Because the truth is, I never stopped caring. I never stopped fighting. And I never stopped believing in why this podcast was created in the first place. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being just a podcast, at least for me. This became my life. Over the last few months, my life became consumed by this fight in ways I never even expected. Behind the scenes, I've been writing motions connected to my husband's case. Not just reading paperwork, actually sitting down night after night, trying to learn how to properly draft legal arguments, understanding procedural rules, organizing evidence, studying case law, and preparing filings connected to his case. And let me tell you something. There is nothing normal about teaching yourself how to navigate a legal system because you feel like you have no other choice. There were nights where I questioned whether I was even capable of doing any of this. But when someone you love is sitting behind bars, you push yourself further than you ever imagined possible. I've also been working on putting together his parole packet for the hearing coming up in June. And honestly, that process alone has been emotionally exhausting for me. Because when you prepare something like that, you are not just gathering paperwork. You are trying to summarize years of a person's life, their growth, rehabilitation, accomplishments, support system, character, and humanity into documents that you hope and pray someone will truly take the time to look at. You're trying to show that this is more than an inmate number, more than just a case file, more than a headline. You're fighting to remind people that there is an actual human being behind those prison walls, and balancing all of that while trying to build an organization, continue advocacy work, support families, and emotionally survive myself, it became very, very overwhelming at times. There were moments where I felt like I was carrying the emotional weight of 10 different lives all at once. But at the same time, this process changed me, because the deeper I got into the system, the more I realized how many other families are living this exact same nightmare every single day. Over the last year, I disappeared from the microphone because I was drowning in research, court records, legal procedures, phone calls, interviews, emotions, frustration, exhaustion, and honestly, moments where I questioned whether I was strong enough to keep carrying all of this. But during that silence, something else was happening. Something bigger was being built. And today, for the first time, I'm going to tell you what that is. When I first created Wickedly Judged, I thought I was starting a podcast. I thought I was creating awareness, giving people a voice, telling stories that mattered. And honestly, I was. But I didn't understand how deeply this work would change me. This podcast was never about entertainment for me. It was never about making money. This podcast was born out of my own pain. It was born from watching someone I love become trapped inside a system that I truly believe failed him. And once you start seeing behind the curtain of the justice system, you can never unsee it. I remember thinking, surely if someone is innocent, the system will eventually fix itself. That truth matters enough. If mistakes are exposed, someone will care enough to correct them. And then I learned something terrifying. Sometimes procedure becomes more important than the truth. Sometimes access to justice depends on how much money you have, how much legal knowledge you have, the timing. Is it an election year? What resources do you have? And understanding systems that most ordinary people were never taught to survive. And that realization, it changes you. It changes your perspective on things. Because suddenly, you aren't just emotionally connected to a case anymore. You become obsessed with understanding everything. At least I have. You become obsessed with understanding court filings, appeals, evidence rules, police reports, witness statements, transcripts, procedural deadlines, records requests, and how it all works. You start trying to teach yourself an entirely different world because you feel like you have no other choice. Nobody else is fighting for you. There were nights when my entire room was covered in paperwork, transcripts stacked on atop legal pads, highlighted court documents, sticky notes hanging out of folders, timelines that were written across notebooks or any kind of paper I could scratch it on, research tabs open all over my laptop. And I would sit there until 3 or 4 in the morning trying to understand legal language I was never trained to understand. Not because I wanted to become a lawyer. Believe me, I don't. But because when you believe someone you love has been wrongfully convicted, you either learn how to fight and stand up to the system, or you drown and your loved one is forgotten. And what hit me even harder was realizing how many other families were drowning too. The messages started coming in from people all over the country, different states, different backgrounds, different cases. But the stories all sounded painfully similar. Missing evidence, unreliable witness statements, false narratives, procedural barriers, families being ignored, people feeling voiceless. And honestly, that broke me in ways I wasn't prepared for. People think advocacy is just standing up and speaking publicly. That's part of it. But advocacy is emotional labor. It's carrying stories that stay with you long after the phone call ends. It's sitting on the phone and hearing a mother cry while asking if her child will ever come home. It's hearing children ask why their parent missed another birthday, another holiday. It's trying to stay emotionally stable while constantly consuming trauma, injustice, and pain. And eventually, I started realizing something that terrified me. The system doesn't just affect incarcerated people. It emotionally imprisons entire families. Birthdays become painful. Holidays feel incomplete. Phone calls become lifelines. Every legal filing becomes attached to a glimmer of hope, and every denial feels like grief all over again. I've been in that situation. I'm going through that exact situation. And believe me, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done. There were moments where I became deeply frustrated. How could our court system be so corrupt and nobody do anything about it? Because families are out here expected to navigate legal terminology, filing deadlines, appellate rules, evidentiary standards, and procedural requirements. while simultaneously surviving emotionally and financially. That's not something that people can do. Most people are not prepared for that. And honestly, they shouldn't have to be. And there's another part of this conversation that people do not talk about enough. Fighting a wrongful conviction is incredibly expensive. And I don't think the average person truly understands just how financially devastating this process becomes. People hear the words appeal or post-conviction motion and think there's some automatic path to justice if mistakes were made. However, the court system is set up so that you never find justice. They make it nearly impossible to get your conviction overturned because nobody wants to admit that they made a mistake. Reality is that innocent people stay behind bars for years, sometimes decades. See, the reality is that transcripts cost money, court filings cost money, attorneys cost money, investigators cost money, experts cost money, travel cost money, records requests cost money, and every single step feels like another financial wall standing between families and the truth. There are families that are draining savings accounts, selling possessions, working extra jobs, borrowing money, sacrificing stability, putting their lives on hold, just trying to keep fighting for someone they love. And what makes it even harder? The system is built in a way where many people eventually run out of resources before they run out of questions. And that's the heartbreaking reality, because once someone is convicted, the burden shifts almost entirely onto the family and the incarcerated person to prove something went wrong. And proving that takes money, time, legal knowledge, emotional endurance, and access to resources that many ordinary people simply do not have. And honestly, the courts know this, and they understand this. They understand that most families are not financially equipped to fight years of legal battles. They understand how overwhelming procedural rules are. They understand how expensive litigation becomes. They understand that many people eventually become emotionally and financially exhausted. And for a lot of families, that exhaustion becomes another barrier to justice. That realization, that hit me hard, because I started realizing that access to justice often depends on access to resources. And that should terrify every single one of us. Truth should not belong only to the people who can afford to chase it. I remember sitting there one night surrounded by paperwork and just thinking, how many people stay trapped simply because nobody knows how to fight correctly? Not because questions don't exist, not because evidence doesn't exist, not because truth doesn't matter, but because procedure became more powerful than access. And eventually, this work started to consume every part of my life. You stop separating your personal life from advocacy. You hear stories and you carry them with you. You think about people sitting inside prison cells while families are trying desperately to hold themselves together on the outside. You become emotionally attached to outcomes that you have no control over, and eventually you burn out. There were days I couldn't even open my inbox because every single message felt heavy. Another family needing help, another person feeling abandoned, another story filled with pain. And I realized something very clearly. I cannot do this alone anymore. And then something happened that changed everything for me. As I became more involved in the advocacy side of the podcast, the risk became more real. And I don't think I fully understood that when I started this journey. There was one particular case I became involved in where the situation became extremely serious. The family connected to the case began receiving threats, not criticism, not online arguments, actual threats to end their life. And when that started happening, everything changed emotionally for me. I remember sitting there thinking, what if this platform is unintentionally putting people in danger? How would I live with myself if something happened to people that were involved in the case that I covered? What if visibility is helping in some ways, but hurting families behind the scenes? And that thought, it absolutely destroyed me. So I made a decision, a very difficult decision, but I wiped all of the episodes of that case from my podcast. Not because I stopped believing in the mission, not because I was ashamed of the work, and not because I gave up, but because protecting people mattered more to me than keeping this content online. And honestly, that decision broke my heart because every episode on this podcast represents pain, research, emotion, truth seeking, and countless hours of work. But at the end of the day, human safety matters more to me than content on this platform. And after that, I'll be honest with you, fear started creeping in. Fear of making the wrong move, fear of hurting a case, fear of exposing families to pressure, fear of emotionally carrying responsibilities bigger than I was prepared for. And I realized something else too. I had been carrying all of this emotionally without any structure. And eventually, that honestly becomes unsustainable. That realization changed everything because I understood something very clearly. If this mission was going to survive, it needed to become bigger than one exhausted person sitting behind a microphone. And honestly, that's where the vision for Wickedly Judged Justice Activation Project was truly born. WJJAP was created because I realized awareness alone is not enough. Families need guidance. Communities need education. Cases need advocacy. And people need support systems. They need to know that they are not alone in this fight. And the families deserve a place where they feel heard. Wickedly Judged Justice Activation Project is an advocacy and justice reform organization focused on wrongful convictions, systemic failures, public education, investigative advocacy, and community action. But more importantly, it's being built to help bridge the gap between families and a system that often feels next to impossible to navigate. We are not just trying to tell stories. We are trying to build a movement because for change to happen, the community needs to come together and be involved. A movement where education of how the law works and how the system works, advocacy, awareness, investigation, and action all work together. One of the biggest focuses of WJJAP is education, because one thing I learned very quickly is that many families involved in these situations have absolutely no idea where to even begin. They don't understand appeals process, post-conviction relief, evidence rules, records request, media strategy, advocacy structure, or even how to organize case materials. And honestly, most people are forced to figure it out while emotionally drowning. That's why we are developing educational courses through WJJAP, courses designed to teach people how to advocate effectively, how to understand the system, organize research, build awareness responsibly, navigate wrongful conviction issues, and how to protect both families and cases while doing advocacy work. We are also building WJJAP as a volunteer-driven organization. Right now, we are actively looking for volunteers, advocates, researchers, organizers, and office directors in multiple states who want to help build this mission locally. And I want to say something very important. You do not need to be a lawyer to make a difference. Some of the most powerful people in this movement are ordinary people who simply refused to stay silent. People that are going through or have gone through what you are currently going through. People who understand how the court system works and what the reality is. We need people to help us grow, help us organize events, assist families, conduct research, help with outreach, support educational efforts, work on awareness campaigns, assist with fundraising, media projects, continue building resources for families that are impacted by wrongful convictions. And eventually, our goal is to have directors and teams across every state in the U.S. working together under the WJJAP mission, not just reacting to injustice, but creating organized support systems for people who feel forgotten and unheard. We are also using Wickedly Judged as the media arm of this mission. The podcast is evolving into something deeper. It's not just storytelling, but education, investigation, interviews, community voices, reform discussions, case awareness, and honest conversations about the emotional reality of this work. This organization was built from pain, but it's being fueled by purpose, because I truly believe there are thousands of families out there who feel invisible right now. I know I disappeared, and for that I am sorry. And I know silence can make people think something ended, but sometimes silent means something is being rebuilt. And that's what happened here. Wickedly Judged was never just a podcast. It was the beginning of something bigger. And now that bigger thing has a name. Wickedly Judged Justice Activation Project. Thank you for staying here with me today. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing that truth still matters. Because this fight, it is far from over. As always, stay informed, stay vigilant, and stay hopeful. Because nobody deserves to be wickedly judged.